Would you care to elaborate a little bit about the few remarks you made in the beginning of your reading about the relationship between the short story beginnings and the collection, Pricksongs and Descants?
Well, beginnings, it really had nothing to do with Pricksongs and Descants as such. I first started writing short fictions. I think maybe most writers do this. You get more opportunity to experiment, to try on new voices and new roles, and so the early years of writing were all short fiction writing. And when I was in the middle of my first full-length book, I tried to get a set of these stories published, but you couldn't do that. And this was before the success days of Bartholomew and so on, and so it was hard to convince publishers this was a good idea. They wanted to see the full-length work first. So in the end, I had to wait for a couple of books to go by, several years, and before they let me have my collection of stories. And by that time, a lot of the stories that I had intended to include in the first collection no longer meant much to me. So I made a small selection of those that seemed to be sort of turning points, ones that introduced me to something really new and seemed to be part of a developing idea about fiction, and that seemed to relate to some of the themes I had by this time decided to incorporate into the collection, so that the idea of Pricksongs and Descants, all the ideas embedded in that collection, dictated a bit to me which stories would be acceptable from the past. So I put a number of those, about 10 of them, I think, into the collection that was published in 1969. And some years later, living in England and having carried around the files of a lot of those stories that got left out, or ideas for stories that had never actually got finished, some of which had been started before any of the pieces in Pricksongs, or at the very latest, some of the same time as some of the earliest ones. I had file drawers full of it, and I was running out of space, and I needed to just clear things out. And so I decided I thought up this idea and saw it as a way. I think I got rid of some 26 failed stories in that one exercise. It probably constitutes the beginning of something else. As a story itself, it's not been collected yet, and it seems to me to be the sort of launching pad for another set of stories, which I hope to get to.
Oh, I see that you're working on now, or thinking of collecting. So thus the marvelous play in there of everything being backwards in that story, that of Adam birthing a child in the form of a turd and naming it Unable, there's a series of things in there that Eve was created before Adam, and so forth. Would you think it's fair to say that in that story you were poking a little fun at yourself?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's one of the few stories I ever wrote. Generally speaking, I write only work entirely out of metaphors that come to me as metaphors containing something of sort of public, literary, and social content. So I don't write about myself or about friends, and this isn't about myself either. But once I got into the idea of using all these little fragments of beginnings, it took me back to the island where, in fact, I did my earliest writing, and so it became, in a kind of, self-mocking way, a kind of bit of autobiography. And so in that sense, yes, it does. And some of the things you pointed out about the story, in fact, what you would think of as reversals and so on, all this has to do with the concept of beginning and when does something begin and so on.
The feeling that I get from many of the things in Pricksongs and Descants, and I was interested in asking you about this, is do you have affinities with our origins, with things like the medieval ring dramas and things? I get a sense in Pricksongs and Descants of, do you know what I'm talking about. Back in the old days, the ring dramas, where the crowd, and like in your stories, the reader can almost, it's a sense of moving from wagon to wagon, and the shepherd's play going on in one, and those wonderful things about Noah and his wife. And
yes, well, that's an interesting comparison. I didn't shape the book around this idea because the book is more entangled than circular. But certainly the kind of folk storytelling procedures. I mean, whether in like ring dramas, or whether just as storytellers around campfires, and all this kind of oral tradition and presentation. Certainly, it's part, and circus quality of it too is certainly part of the collection.